as Musalia, Mudavadi, the author of the book Soaring Above the Storms of Passion. But what are the storms? What is the passion? Is the title given justice? Yes, indeed. The young boy comes to Nairobi, attends schools which you memories of Nairobi Primary School. He doesn't stop there. He has fond memories of Jamhuri School. You will find and they call them phantom. But in order to Louisianize the English word phantom, they sometimes say fandom. But he does not stop there. Beyond that, he tells you how he is a reluctant politician, but he doesn't say that early. He talks about how he joined the University of Nairobi to study at what was then and is still the university. The passions begin then. There are many halls at the University of Nairobi, including Hall 13, Nkrumah, but lo and behold is in Elgon. And those of you at the University of Nairobi know Elgon is a 10 by 10. And each of the people who join him as his roommates, there is no shortage of them, I sympathize. The readers will know your sympathy when you go. But that is the time of beauty. He tells us, and you remind me about Mateso Bila Chuki. So Tesi, there was a time when the Honorable Musalia would go all the way to Isli in a bar called Mateso Bila Chuki. And there are many things that you find at the university. He introduces, and I can remember this, the attempted coup d'etat, and he reminds us how he himself was victimized, giving meaning to the Kiswahili saying, mtego wa panya huingia waliomo na wasiokuwemo. But ultimately, you are found to be blameless. And he graduates. When he graduates, he goes into the private sector. Lo and behold, the patriarch is alive and well, bestriding the Luhia political terrain like the fabled Colossus. He is the spokesperson. And he reminds us how fate comes and ultimately the patriarch is taken away and he is introduced into the murky waters of politics. Reluctant he is, but he admits and succumbs because when duty calls, you oblige. And he begins to soar, and he begins to meet the headwinds of politics. He joins, he reminds us how he is driven. I remember that, Wycliffe. When at night you are driving in that Datsun from Vihiga, when at night you arrive in Kisumu, when you meet Haya, when you drive, when you come to Nairobi and meet Waiganjo, I remember that. And when you have met Waiganjo, I remember you meet President Moi at State House, I remember that. And I remember how he persuades you, and I remember that Pujo. I hope you've kept it as a memento. There is a sense in which he's introduced into politics, and somehow, because fate conspires with other things, such as one's own passion, he ends up in politics and he climbs the ladder, a newly elected member of the parliament, but the president in his wisdom chooses to make him a minister. He says that his ministry was so small it ought to have been a department, but you are minister nevertheless. So that there is a sense in which he begins to grow. And he tells us, and I encourage you to read, he now introduces you, and he reminds us, those who are in the business of forgetting, that that was a difficult moment. He reminds us, and my good friend Honorable Mika Chesarem has told us, when ultimately the Kenyan terrain was beginning to change. And you'll read in the book about perestroika and glasnost. He talks about that. He talks about the wind of change in the year 2000, in 1989, and ultimately in 2000. And he does not stop there. He goes and reminds us about the changes that come. He talks about the Constitution, and Amos Tuswila Wako, you are mentioned many times and fondly. And he mentioned the changes. Martha Wangari Karua, my very good friend, you are mentioned there. The contribution that you make. And there are many people that are mentioned there. Even you, Julius Sunkuli, you are mentioned there. Farah Malim, you are mentioned there. Musikari Kombo, you are mentioned there. Read the book, because we are soaring above the storms of passion. But what are those storms of passion? He goes beyond that and tells us how the changes, how we begin to change. He tells us how the coup d'etat changes the scheme of things in Kenya, how we very rapidly go into the multi-party era, how things change. And he doesn't stop there. He talks about the bombers of Kenya. Suswila Amos Wako will remember 101 days we met there. Chris Murungaru will remember there. Read the book. This is all I'm asking you. I'm only whetting your appetite. There are things to read. And then he tells us and demonstrates to us how Kenyan politics mutates and metamorphoses. He tells us how Daniel Moi prevails upon them to allow multi-party. He reminds you about Ford. How many of you remember Ford? How many of you remember the word Ford Asili? How many of you remember NAC? How many of you remember all those political parties? How many of you remember LDP? How many of you remember NDP? How many of you remember NAC, NAK, or NARC, as Martin Shikuku would have said, NARC? All those are there. And he brings us into the arena of the year 2000, and he doesn't stop there. He brings us into 2007. He brings us to 2013. He brings us to 2017. If I continue like this, you'll never buy the book. So wisdom demands that I now stop, if only to remind us that this is a book that demonstrates and exposes to us a man who writes about soaring above the storms of passion. But what emerges as he confronts these storms is that he's a man who does so, if you use the correct English word, with preternatural equanimity. There is a sense in which this book is well written. After he has written all those, starting as he did, and as I said, with the prologue, with the foreword, with the African child, and going into all those chapters, we end on page 390, he says. And we have written yet another chapter in the history of Kenyan politics, which changes. Perhaps only time will tell. I do not know how many copies have been made in the first print, but when they are doing the second print, Honorable Wycliffe Musalia Mudavadi'S, you will have an epilogue. This is a book that is well written. Those who care, there is a gem here. As I said at the beginning, reading the excerpts with their typical sensationalization only gives you a jaundiced view. Those whom he does not agree with, he disagrees with them in an agreeable manner. Those whom he holds the same opinion with, he does not praise them hyperbolically. He deals with them gently. Gentility is the watchword. This is a good book. Well written, well midwifed. Behold, a good book. Behold, one that deserves good reading. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Professor PLO Lumumba.